Yeah. I would have thought a lot.
We're going to get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Katherine Boothe from the Department of Political Science here at McMaster. Katie was here, I'm thinking it was about 2 years ago, or was it 3 already? It's 3, okay, there you go, I should have just added a year on that. And was kind enough to come back. Really pleased to have you back, Katie. Some of you in the room will know Katie's work quite well. I know that it's assigned in my course, and perhaps others, and some of you have actually taken courses with Katie. So really pleased though to have you actually here, spending an hour talking about some of your new research, which we've chatted on a little bit, but I'm quite interested in hearing more about, which is some comparative health policy work in the area of cost effectiveness analysis, and as usual doing that comparative approach using a number of jurisdictions as your source of data. So welcome, and I'll turn things over to you, and you know how it works.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot. All right, stand here, okay?
That's good.
So thanks again for that introduction, and thank you very much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here at CHEPA. I did speak to you about 3 years ago about my dissertation research, which was looking at the development of public drug insurance in Canada, the UK, and Australia. So the paper that I'm presenting today is the first step in a new research program, and it's using some interesting information about cost-effectiveness analysis programs that I came across during my thesis research. So at the time, I didn't really know what to do about it, and this paper is an opportunity for me to develop some preliminary hypotheses about what the data means and how it can be used, and also to plan the next steps for the research. So it's a time when I'll really be able to benefit from your comments and questions and feedback. I'm going to try not to speak for too long this afternoon, but please feel free to stop me if you have questions as I go along. So, why cost effectiveness analysis? Some of you might recognize the young woman in the center of the photo there. She's been in the news lately. Her name is Maddie Vadstone. She has cystic fibrosis, and she recently met with Premier Wynne to request the Ontario Drug Benefit Plan cover Kalydeco, which is a new drug for cystic fibrosis. It's quite an expensive drug, and at this time it's only indicated for people with a specific genetic mutation. So quite a small patient population, about 118 people in Canada. Now, Kalydeco has gone through the Common Drug Review, and CDR has recommended that it be subsidized by public drug plans. They recognize its therapeutic effectiveness, but their recommendation is pending the negotiation of a lower price. They say Kalydeco is not cost effective at the manufacturer's proposed price. So the manufacturer, Vertex, has been negotiating with the provinces through the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance for a little over a year now, and they haven't yet reached an agreement. Sort of a frustrating side note to this story is Vertex received funding to support the development of Kalydeco from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation through their relatively new venture philanthropy initiative. So that's not why I bring up this story, though. I bring it up because it's a good recent example of one of the basic problems of public drug plans, which is which drug should you subsidize? So if you're a public drug plan, you have a few options for dealing with this problem. One, you could have an open formulary where you subsidize drugs as they receive regulatory approval. This is straightforward, but as you might imagine, fairly expensive. The other option is to have some sort of program of formulary management. You probably have an expert committee who recommends listing of drugs based on their clinical effectiveness, their impact on drug plan budgets, maybe the burden of disease. But these are difficult decisions. How do you figure out how much you should be paying for innovation? How do you justify unpopular negative decisions? It's particularly important for those politicians who are ultimately responsible for formulary decision making. And so starting in the early 1990s, there's this new tool for formulary management, which is use cost-effectiveness analysis. This allows the expert committees to compare the therapeutic cost of therapeutic advantages of a drug rather with its economic costs, and provides a scientific basis for decision making. So, my paper looks at the adoption of 4 pioneering cost-effectiveness analysis programs, or CEA programs. Australia in 1987, Ontario in 1994, the UK in 1999, and Canada at a national level in 2002. And these programs are in some ways quite similar. They all reference the paradigm of evidence-based policymaking that was becoming more prominent around this time. And there's a lot of similarities in their technical guidelines as well. However, I argue that there's actually some politically significant variation in the goals and mandates of these programs. Specifically, I'm looking at whether CEA programs are primarily directed towards achieving value for money, or perhaps even cost containment, or whether they're primarily directed towards standardizing access to care and access to pharmaceuticals. In terms of mandate, I'm looking at whether the scope of review is comprehensive or selective. Which drugs do they review? Are they regulatory or advisory? Are the committee's recommendations binding or not? Are the committees involved in pricing or not? And as far as I can tell, these types of differences have not received a lot of systematic study, but they have implications for how CEA programs affect the broader system of pharmaceutical policy within a given jurisdiction, and I think how CEA programs adapt to a changing policy context for pharmaceutical purchasing and reimbursement. And so the big changes in context that I'm thinking of here are the move from an era of patented blockbuster drugs to an era of generic high-volume drugs and these new so-called niche buster drugs, right? Expensive drugs for increasingly more limited indications like Kalydeco, and also the increasing use of confidential price agreements between manufacturers and public purchasers. So in the second part of my talk, I'm going to present the preliminary results of the research about how and why these 4 CEA programs vary. And in the final portion, I'll return to my questions about the reform of CEA programs and the next steps in the research. The data for this paper is based on a set of interviews with policy practitioners and experts in the UK, Australia, and Canada at the federal level. I have not yet conducted provincial interviews, although I'm planning them now, and also the secondary literature and government documents. The research question that I used to organize it is, given that all jurisdictions are responding to the same paradigm, this paradigm of evidence-based policymaking, with the same tool, cost-effectiveness analysis, what causes variation in the program goals and mandates? My hypotheses are based on the literature on agenda setting and institutional approaches to public policy, particularly the literature on policy legacies. And I expect that the goals and mandates of CEA programs will vary according to the nature of the problem that prompted their adoption. Another way of saying this would be the characteristics of the policy window that allowed for this regulatory innovation, and also the institutional structure in which they're adopted, particularly with reference to existing policies for formulary management, pricing, and the scope of public benefits. I expect that the characteristics of goals and mandates will cluster, so it should be possible to identify types of CEA programs and compare the way they're reformed over time and their impact on a broader process of pharmaceutical policy reform. I'm describing the 4 programs that I studied as either pragmatic in Australia and Ontario, or special in England and Wales and Canada. I mean, I say UK in the title, but the Scottish Medicines Consortium is actually a separate process from NICE. I'm open to suggestions about better titles here, especially for the special ones, but that's my placeholder. Today I'm going to tell the story of Australia and the UK for the most part, because I expect they'll be a little less familiar, but please do ask me questions about Ontario and Canada. So my ideal pragmatic program has a main public goal of value for money, but in conversation or in commentary, experts acknowledge an unofficial goal of cost containment, even as they acknowledge that cost-effective drugs may contribute to growth in drug budgets, right? There's no reason that value for money should necessarily go along with cost containment, but people talk about them together. In terms of mandate, the ideal pragmatic program is regulatory, meaning it has a legislative basis and or binding recommendations. It has a comprehensive scope of review, and it makes some contribution to price negotiations. The ideal special program has a different main public goal. Its public goal is to reduce variation in access to pharmaceuticals, or relatedly reduce the duplication of efforts in the review of pharmaceuticals. It may mention value for money, but this is secondary. And actually, in these 4 programs, the difference in how the top 2 programs talk about value for money versus the bottom 2 programs was fairly striking. I was a little surprised by that. In terms of mandate, the ideal special program is advisory, which means it has no legislative basis and or binding recommendations. It has a selective scope of review and no link to pricing. I know at some point, at this point, probably some of you are thinking, well, wait, NICE single technology assessments are binding since 2002. They are. And so this binding, non-binding thing is a bit of a sticking point in the typology right now. I think it's an important one. I think there's a causal importance to it, so I'm going to come back to it, but I'd really appreciate hearing what you think about it. Once I've told you a little bit more about why I think it's important. Australia is an example of a pragmatic program. It passed a legislative requirement for cost-effectiveness analysis in 1987, which was even before they'd managed to develop any pharmacoeconomic guidelines. That came a little later. The legislation was described by one interviewee as, quote, a law against higher prices, and it was passed at a time when the government was very concerned about the rising cost of the Universal Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. This was something that was mentioned in the minister's speech introducing the bill in Parliament. CEA was an addition to an existing process of formulary control. The Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, or PBAC, had been making reimbursement decisions for all new drugs since the PBS was adopted in the early 1950s. Before 1987, the PBAC officially made its reimbursement decisions based on clinical efficacy. However, at this time there was also an unofficial cost minimization component that came into play in the late 1960s or early 1970s. And this came about because of an influential bureaucrat named Arthur Shields, who had developed a program whereby new drugs would not be offered a higher price than a comparator unless they also offered a real therapeutic advantage, as determined by Shields himself, who was a pharmacist by training. So this is clearly not evidence-based, and it was not official, but by all accounts it did save the public plan a good deal of money. According to one interviewee who was involved in designing the first pharmacoeconomic guidelines in Australia, this meant that although the new requirements for evidence were, in his words, radical, the principles on which the new program were based were, quote, simply trying to formalize something that had already been going on. So, in Australia, the problem of increasing pharmaceutical expenditures led to an official goal of achieving value for money, but commentators also acknowledge an important unofficial goal of cost containment when they're thinking about the rationale for doing CEA. It built on an existing program of formulary control, and this resulted in a comprehensive mandate for assessing all new drugs, and also gave it a significant role in recommending appropriate prices. The PBAC process is regulatory in the strictest sense. It has a statutory basis, and its recommendations are binding. So the minister cannot list a drug on the PBS formulary without a positive recommendation from PBAC. Interviewees tended to phrase this as no means no, yes means maybe, in terms of whether your drug receives public funding. Now, the Pragmatic Program in Ontario is similar in many ways. It has a legislative basis and a comprehensive scope of review, but the difference in Ontario is that the committee's recommendations are not binding. The committee to evaluate drugs may reject a drug based on price, but the drug plan's executive officer can and does list a drug that has received a negative recommendation if she is able to negotiate a satisfactory price. So the drug doesn't have to go back through the cost effectiveness analysis process in this case. So in Ontario, no means negotiate a product listing agreement. Right? It's a little bit different. In the UK, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, now the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, was created in 1999 when the government was concerned about the introduction of expensive new drugs for MS and Alzheimer's, among others. With these drugs, though, the primary concern wasn't necessarily their contribution to the overall drug budget. They were a problem because they were high-profile contributors to an ongoing issue with postcode prescribing or geographical variation in access to pharmaceuticals. The British NHS, as you may know, has an open formulary for its prescription services, but local bodies have some discretion over their health budgets, and this means that some might choose to fund an expensive new drug while others do not. According to the first chair of NICE, in the late 1990s, this problem had become, quote, politically unacceptable, and was the main motivation for the creation of a CEA program that was meant to provide consistent expert advice on these expensive new drugs. So this different problem, or different framing of the problem in the UK, led to very different goals and mandates than the Pragmatic Program I described in Australia. Also important to note here that Australia and Ontario were adding a new tool to an existing program of formulary management. The UK and also Canada were essentially starting from scratch with their cost effectiveness analysis programs. So for NICE, the goals included value for money, but there's really no discussion of cost containment, even in an unofficial sense. As the chair of NICE said in an interview, quote, right from the start, I said we wouldn't save the NHS any money. There's also a very different mandate here. NICE only assesses drugs on the request of the Department of Health. So they're looking at expensive or marginal treatments that are expected to have a big impact on the NHS budget. This means that although NICE uses the same basic techniques for cost effectiveness analysis as these other programs, it's not a tool for overall formulary control, and it's not currently involved in price negotiations, although there's been some discussion about value-based pricing in the UK where NICE would presumably be involved. Okay, now in terms of mandate, this is that sticking point that I mentioned earlier, because NICE is regulatory. It has a statutory basis, and since 2002, its single technology assessments, which means it's assessments of single drugs, are mandatory for local funding bodies. They must list positive recommendations. So notice that this is backwards from the PBAC in Australia, right? In Australia, you cannot list a negative recommendation, and what you do with positive recommendations is up to you, you being the Minister of Health. In England and Wales, you must list positive recommendations, you being the local funder, and what you do with negative recommendations is up to you.
But the Minister can reject NICE's recommendations.
Yes.
The Minister's
Yes.
not mandated to. So there's a difference between the recommendations are nice and the policies of the minister.
Right. So once the minister accepts a guidance, though,
Once he
the
adopts
local
the guidance,
bodies,
then
yeah.
it's not.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's an important distinction here. Okay. So this is what I know so far. And I got interested in this problem of CEA programs because when these programs were adopted, they were a new evidence-based tool for solving the basic listing problem. But recently, there's been some suggestion that CEA might be losing its relevance. It was a tool created to evaluate innovative, high-volume drugs where patents prevented price competition. But, of course, these blockbuster drugs are now off patent, and the innovative drugs that are coming out are really quite different. They're designed for increasingly small groups of patients at increasingly high costs. So, what happens when cutting-edge institutions and processes for CEA are no longer cutting-edge and maybe not even particularly relevant? Do policymakers say, let's dismantle them and put all our efforts into securing cheap generics or solving the problems presented by expensive drugs for rare diseases? Or do they persist, despite what might be an increasingly poor match with the prevailing policy context? My suspicion is that CEA programs do persist to an important degree. They do not just provide a disembodied set of technical rules. In each of these 4 jurisdictions, CEA is part of an institution and a discourse about how to manage a very important part of the health system that has been in place for quite some time. So the most immediate thing that I need to do next is to gather more data about the origins of the programs and their links to variation in goals and mandates, add at least one additional jurisdiction. BC adopted a CEA program in 1995, at the same time it introduced therapeutic reference pricing. So that's next. And then I have 2 main questions for ongoing research. First, is there convergence in mandates and perhaps even goals of CEA programs as they respond to new challenges? Especially, how do they respond to the routine use of product listing agreements or risk-sharing agreements? And I think this is where the difference between binding and non-binding recommendations becomes really quite important, because some researchers have suggested that manufacturers can effectively game the CEA system if they post a high commercial price, know that the drug will not be cost effective at this price, but then negotiate a confidential product listing agreement without having to go through additional cost effectiveness analysis. And I think this raises questions about transparency and accountability in the policy process. The second overarching question is, do pragmatic and special programs, maybe not special programs, I'm really not sure about that one, do they influence the process of pharmaceutical policy reform differently, particularly through their influence on politicians' ideas? And here I'm wondering whether these programs prime politicians who may not be involved in the day-to-day management of a drug plan to focus on different problems related to pharmaceuticals, particularly since the different CEA programs are going to create different new problems of their own. And here, the kinds of questions that I'm interested in are, how high profile are CEA programs? What values do they reference? What are politicians' options and responses when they're confronted with political controversy over a listing decision? So how effective are CEA programs as a tool for blame avoidance? And I think this clearly varies between the types I've identified. So I'm hoping that these questions will allow me to better understand this particular aspect of pharmaceutical policy, and will also allow me to draw some broader conclusions about the reform of independent regulatory processes. I'd really welcome your suggestions for other potential research questions and your comments about the findings that I've presented so far. And thanks a lot for your attention.
So this is nice in that we have lots of time to help you at the next phases of your work.
Hoping to
Okay, so questions, some things you want to suggest to Katie as she develops this work further? I'm happy to start and as people go, okay, Michelle?
Do we have any is there any database, for instance, that would give from let's say a large number of countries an idea of the differences in terms of listing of drugs and pricing of drugs? So I don't know whether the OECD, for instance, or IMS would have anything that would allow you to say at the end it makes a difference, or well, they can use whatever they want. They have to list the same price and approximately the same price.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's not a database that's not, especially for pricing, definitely
No.
not for pricing. For listing though, and there has been, the existing research on CEA programs is very interested in this question of does it affect listing decisions, and it hasn't been able to draw a lot of strong conclusions about that, I think, because there's usually a bunch of other factors, of course, that also affect listing decisions, and even just trying to determine how harmonized formularies are across jurisdictions is pretty difficult. So, as far as I know, there's not really a simple way to look that up, but other people are definitely interested in it and working on it.
But there is variation. So
Yes. Oh, yes, certainly.
I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about why CAs perceived as being irrelevant given the change or the increased prominence of drugs for more niche markets. Why does that make it less relevant to the decisions that these bodies have to make?
So, not necessarily irrelevant, but it has to work quite differently if you're assessing a drug that costs $300,000 a year and is only going to be used for 118 patients, versus if you're assessing the cost effectiveness of, a statin or an antidepressant or any of these higher volume drugs, because
But why? Why does it have to work differently?
it has to. Well, you have to change your standards, because you can't. The drugs for the lower volume drugs are never going to have a cost per quality that's comparative to the old high volume drugs when they were assessed.
Is that volume or price that's driving that?
Probably a bit of both, right?
So why is volume driving it?
Well, volume is driving it because the benefits are concentrated on such a small patient population.
So why does that matter?
Because, well,
One person takes one pill.
yeah,
If 10 people each take one pill, or one person takes one pill, what's the difference?
Is it partly fixed costs, the sense that they're being spread across a smaller patient population?
But that would be in price.
And therefore, that's what I mean, so the cost.
That would be in price, right?
well, right, and so the price, so maybe I answered that wrong. I mean, the part of the reason the price is so high is because the manufacturer doesn't expect a lot of people to buy the drug, right? They have to put the same amount of research into developing it, but it's not going to be used by.
But those are all sunk costs anyway. At the end of the day, they put the research in, they're gonna sell it for whatever they can get for it.
Right.
So why isn't everything in price? Why does volume matter at all?
I guess volume matters because it affects price.
Okay, but it's only an indirect influence.
Sure.
Okay.
Volume could be just an ideological difference too. It might not matter in the analysis itself. It just might matter in the perception of what the drug's going to be used for, which is
So why would that matter?
just because people might think that if it's a rare drug used for a small population, then people might connect the idea that all the research done on these drugs for a small population means that the price is going to be higher for it.
So,
And the manufacturers might be able to get away with that just through pure perception of that connection, the physical connection between those two factors.
I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, I mean, another factor is that cost-effectiveness analysis isn't the only thing that goes into these listing decisions, right? Usually they also still have a component for considering the burden of disease, which is, these considerations are not necessarily transparent or easy to understand which factors are most important in which decisions, but is a drug the only treatment for a life-threatening illness? Is it a treatment that's only going to help a very small number of people? Again, there isn't a lot of easy information available about this.
Well, volume has never mattered. When you look at these small drugs, they've never considered opportunity costs. Or the only thing they've used is average rate of return, or the inverse of average rate of return. So the volume has never mattered. They've never brought volume into consideration. They look at the ratio, they make up a number to say what ratio will be sufficient, and they admit they make that up. It's got no scientific basis. And then they take that decision. So volume's never come into it at all. So why is this different now under this new scenario that volume somehow is an important factor now?
Well, I think it's an important factor if it drives the price and makes it impossible to have a cost per quality that's similar, that's comparable to the arbitrary cost per quality that was acceptable before.
Well, that means your average rate of return isn't that important, because surely volume is part of that.
I'm gonna go to, cause I know Kaylin, you've had is it right on this point?
Yeah, so I was just wondering if this distinction is actually, and I forget what the first slide looks like, where you separated out the different cases into two different groups. And I'm wondering if it has something to do with the mandate. So was your reading of the data suggesting that this type of statement about it becoming less important now than it has been in the past, given these new diseases? Is it coming mostly from those specialist programs or mostly from the other ones? Because pragmatic, the reason I'm asking is because the specialist programs, in the NICE case, you suggested it's an equity consideration. And in my understanding, a high volume relationship with equity is much more reasonable an assertion to make than it is for something where it's not, right? Like if you're talking about equity among 118 people, I don't know that comes into a political discussion, but if you're talking about statins and the availability of statins across England, in all the regions of England, it becomes much more salient. So I'm just wondering if that's reflected in your data or not, and maybe that's a...
It's something that I haven't thought much about because the initial concerns about postcode prescribing had to do with high volume drugs, but now, NICE is still just looking at expensive new drugs, and they're not necessarily statin type drugs, so that's
Yeah, because if equity is the driving factor behind using CEA, then in my head it makes more sense to really worry about the high volume drugs, and therefore nowadays if you're looking only at the niche markets where 118 patients across the entire country matter, then the discussion is different because you're not being driven in the same way by equity considerations for 118 people than you would be for, say, 60 million people. Right? So I don't know, it's just something to think about.
Yeah.
But I agree that with Arthur and Steve and Jerry, like the assertion that volume matters doesn't, when you look at the ratio and how it's constructed for a CEA, it doesn't matter at all. So yeah, I would just look into that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Just on that, maybe to extend that, I've heard anecdotes about this. My sense was if the volume's small, they're willing to say, well, ignore the fact that it's not cost effective because the budget impact won't be big. So it's really, the entire thing's be driven by cost, by budgets. And even if you have a low-cost drug, if it's for lots of people, they might say no because of the budget impact. And so this is this conflict in the difference between the cost impact and cost effectiveness. And anyway, I think teasing through how these agencies think about those issues is quite important, because in some sense it's saying, oh gosh, it's really expensive, really not cost effective, but what the heck, it's only 118 people. We can handle it. And so we'll start to care less about this.
Right, but some of these bodies are tasked with caring about budget impact, and some of them aren't.
Right.
CDR, what is their mandate to care about budget impact?
And that would work into the first instance as well, where you're talking about the pragmatic rationale behind pursuing these programs, because it's pragmatic. It doesn't really matter if you're trying to contain costs and get value for money. 118 people doesn't matter. So I think it would be worth to see if you can tease out that with the different models. And if it doesn't fit, I don't know what to do. I don't have the answers, but.
I know Leanne has a question, but I'm gonna jump in just because it's right on this point of the different groups or programs. So when I heard you talk about programs and then you describe them, I'm thinking, what is your definition of a program, or this idea of the unit of analysis, to think of it in a different way? Because sometimes it's committee, it's advisory body, you also talked about the ministers getting involved. So as you develop this further and you think about your interviewing in particular, right, you want to be really clear about how you're defining a program and what it looks like in each of these different jurisdictions, because to the points that have already been made, this looks really different depending on the accountability. I thought your discussion about the regulatory, whether it's in legislation, really important, and that actually sent some signals off for me in some of my own work. We really haven't done a very good job, I think, of laying out what these programs look like and what are their various relationships and accountabilities through inside and outside of government. So that's interesting for the development. Okay, Ian.
I just have a quick question. Where do value judgments sort of come into this process, or are they not considered at all in cost effective analysis?
What do you mean by value judgment?
Just so you mentioned that the cost effective analysis, the sort of paradigm driving this evidence-based policy making, so are there other things that are considered in cost effective analysis, or is it just mainly?
Well, I think there's a couple things there. First of all, is the question is, where does the buck stop with regards to making the listing decisions matter? Because Ontario, for example, I'm just going to show you this. These are two recent in the last 3 years, recommendations where the Committee to Evaluate Drugs recommended not listing a drug, and the executive officer decided to list a drug, and she can do that. She has the authority to do that. Her mandate is to consider the CED's recommendations as well as budget impact, input from patient groups. There's actually a pretty broad mandate for the things that she consider. I put these both up because one of them, the drug on the right here, was recommended on the basis that it was rejected on the basis that it doesn't provide value for money, and the executive officer was able to negotiate a satisfactory pricing agreement with the manufacturer that we can't know about. And the one on the left, the CED rejected the drug because they didn't think there was enough data about efficacy and safety, and the executive officer was able to come up with a pricing plan that I'm still learning about these. I have a lot to learn about these processes, and I put these ones up because they're a bit of a head scratcher for me. This is a very roundabout way of saying, in a process like Ontario, there's probably lots of room for values to come in because the actual factors that lead to a positive recommendation are not transparent. The executive officer has a fair amount of discretion. I didn't put up, I don't have an example of a PBAC listing recommendation from Australia because it would be completely illegible even at the side of tiny, dense type. And there is, I think discretion is a little bit more limited. You know, the PBAC has this historic mandate for assessing clinical efficacy. They now have a patient representative, at least one patient representative, sitting on their board. So it's a bit of a question about how much non-CEA stuff may play into their decision, but my understanding at this point is that they leave a little bit less room for discretion, and so potentially less room for these other factors to come in.
Mark?
I was wondering, in terms of the case selection, it seems like the Australia, UK, and Ontario would have similar kind of health systems arrangements, so that you would have similar, it would be like most similar cases, right? But when you throw in Canada at the federal level, that seems almost like an odd case to throw in there, especially when you talk about the CDR, and it's kind of even like a system embedded within another system,
So the case selection here was a very scientific, this is the data I have, based on, you know, I did these interviews as part of my dissertation research, and they all talked about these programs and they talked about it differently, and I was still making sense of it. I mean, I think it's justifiable to look at these four though, because they're often mentioned in the literature as pioneers, as early adopters. There's some evidence of emulation in some cases, and I suspect a broader scope of research might find additional evidence of emulation with jurisdictions that adopted it later. I'm hoping that by adding BC, I can correct a little bit of this problem with data first, hypotheses later. Let's go back here. The reason I think the CDR is a good one to include is because it's like the UK, it's like NICE in that it has this different goal. Different from Ontario and Australia, and it's different because, like NICE, it's not involved in formulary management, and so I think it's actually there's a good reason to keep it in there. And I don't actually know how many more examples there are of CEA programs that have really no role in formulary management, but these are two anyway.
Yeah, this limit regional variation in the UK, I mean, sure, in the original documentation, postcode prescribing was a problem we wanted to solve, but you can't separate that out from the so-called value for money, because that's the basis on what they're doing, the attempt to limit regional variation. So, I mean, the billions of pounds that have been put into this cost-effectiveness evaluation wouldn't have been needed if all you wanted to do was limit regional variation. You just tell people that if it's available here, it's going to be available everywhere. So you don't need CEA to do that. So, and if you go to the documentation opposed to what people are telling you, it's quite honest, people tell you anything in interviews, the documentation makes it very clear. It's about maximising the impact of the resources devoted to drugs on the health of the population.
Sure, but do those documents talk about cost containment?
No, they talk about maximising the impact of the resources devoted to the programme. Not about cost containment, it's supposed to be budgeted, it's supposed to be a hard budget.
Right.
So it's saying not about cost containment, it's about maximising the impact of how you use those resources.
But that's different from Australia and
Oh
Ontario.
yeah, but I'm saying this regional variation, it's not all about regional variation, even though people might be telling you that. and it's quite explicit in the documentation. It says we've got 2 goals here. But to do, how can you limit regional variation without having some sort of criteria?
Sorry,
How can you implement limited regional variation without having, what are you going to limit it on? You're going to limit it on, presumably, cost effectiveness. So you're going to find, if there's a ratio that's acceptable, we want everybody to have it. If there's a ratio that isn't acceptable, we want no one to have it. So it's not like they're separate goals in a sense.
Right, but because this, and I'm not totally sure that this answers your question, but what that made me think of is the fact that the review that NICE undertakes is selective, then is really important here. Because they're not saying everyone should have access to cost-effective drugs, they're saying everyone should have the same access to drugs that are political problems or potential political problems on the basis of whether they're cost effective or not. Because they're not reviewing all new drugs, it's not like they're getting rid of the potential for regional variation, but they're getting rid of, by having this positive binding requirement, they're getting rid of regional variation on expensive drugs or drugs that are only the only treatment for the new treatment for and the only treatment for a life-threatening illness. So I think the selective element, the selective scope of review there becomes an important distinguishing feature related to the goals. But I'm going to.
I think it's just this absence of the VFM in that column. It sort of hits me that you know, it's quite
what
clearly
you're saying is in the
documentation.
documentation,
Yeah,
that
it's
is
all
also a goal. And so
And all
that's
the work that's done under
suggestion.
NICE is based on that. You know,
Okay.
it's all based on that.
Maybe we could talk about this after too. I'd be very interested to hear more.
Kaylin, sorry,
No, no,
Michelle. Kaylin and then Michelle.
I was just wondering, you talked about policy legacies at the beginning, and I was wondering if you started to tease some of those things out. And in particular, I'm interested in understanding how different structures that have actually led to the ways in which these different organizations have been set up have influenced the mandate or the objectives. And the reason I'm asking is because it seems to me as though, you know, you mentioned values can probably permeate the process in Ontario much more than they might be able to in the UK. Pardon?
Australia.
Oh, Australia. I don't know if you'd say the same thing, but I'm just wondering if there's differences in the kind of history behind how they've been developed, whether they were inclusive or, you know, from the outset, if the legacies suggested that interests can come and play a role in Ontario, which in my kind of preliminary reading of the situation has been that it's been much more people at the table having discussions behind closed doors versus NICE, which was set up as kind of part of a political response to something, which, you know, kind of was all about transparency, like from the beginning. So I'm wondering if you've started to tease any of those things out in the analysis yet.
So my basis for saying that policy legacies matter has a lot to do with the distinction between programs that built on existing formulary management and programs that started from scratch. And I'm really still thinking about the specific causal mechanisms here. I think that it's an area where the research needs a fair amount of work. I mean, before I started looking at the data, I thought that the scope of public benefits was going to be a really important determinant to the mandate and goals of these programs. You know, are the plans purchasing drugs for everyone or for a very, you know, actually a relatively limited population? And now I'm not so sure that matters. So I still have it on my list, but there isn't sort of that obvious causal link there. So the one thing though that it's comforting me a little bit as I'm thinking about these categories and thinking about the causal explanations is that is actually that there is variation in the binding, non-binding among what might turn out to be sort of arbitrary types here. Because, you know, as I've been thinking about it, well, is this just sort of a boring functionalist argument where they get a program because they wanted that type of program, right? So, I think maybe it still is. But I think it's good that there's this variation because it suggests it's not just the difference, it's not solely the difference in the framing of the initial problem when the program was adopted. Because if you're a pragmatic program and you want to, you know, why have a binding versus a non-binding program? Binding program, probably better for blame avoidance. I would expect that Australia's program would be better for blame avoidance because if the minister chooses, he or she can sort of throw up their hands and said, PBAC says no. I mean, yes, they can go around it, it's a complicated process, but, and that opportunity doesn't exist in Ontario. So why make that choice? I don't know why make that choice, but it does suggest to me that there's a sort of more complicated and potentially more interesting causal story here than, you know, the main political problem was cost containment versus the main political problem was something else.
Yeah. So I was thinking of the question you asked about the cases and possibly adding new cases to the study, and I may be totally wrong, but I have a sense that let's say CEA is well, there can be variations in the way CEA is implemented, but there could be also an alternative to CEA, which would be some kind of competition. So we could think that we don't really need CEA if the market provides a price. And then I was thinking, and I guess that's what happened in England, where they started with GPFH. We were supposed to negotiate prices with pharmaceutical companies, and then they thought that they needed a CEA and parametric price. But I was thinking, for instance, Germany or the Netherlands or Switzerland, where they try to implement competition as a way to solve these issues. Do they have CEA? Do they have any kind of regulation? Do they have any kind of binding price that everybody, because that, in a sense, that's the negation of competition. If you have competition across health insurance, why would you have a CEA that would tell everybody the same price? And
right,
then competition would be useless. So I was wondering whether adding, I don't know, maybe it's too complex, I don't know, but maybe adding the Netherlands or Switzerland to your cases could help understand that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. That's a great idea. We will definitely.
And for Switzerland, maybe complex because they also have a powerful pharmaceutical industry, so that might change the picture a bit.
Two or three things. One, I think in some of our discussion we might be confusing values with discretion, because it might actually be your values that you don't want discretion. It could be that the Australian values are such that they want a system that has no discretion for. So I think we're using them as synonyms, or at least we have in the room today at times. I'm not sure we should be. And then the second thing, coming back to the volume issue. So I can think of reasons that you didn't bring up why we might care about volume.
Great.
So
I'm ready.
one of the key, it has nothing to do with CEA in some sense. You might be frightened of low volume, high price drugs because physicians prescribe off-label. And you might start off thinking that it's only 118 patients, but 5 years later it might be 6,000 patients.
And they're already working on it.
And physicians, I don't know what percentage of drugs are prescribed off-label, but I suspect that it's a fairly high percentage. And it's a real problem. So I think there's a meta game, a higher level
And PLA is
concern.
trying to deal with that, right?
Right.
So we don't get to know.
I can think of reasons to answer our question, but it's nothing to do with CEA. There are other issues, and I think off-label prescribing would be at the top of my list. And then again, just to build on Michelle's point, I think putting a couple of non-Westminster countries, it might be not the first paper, but the next paper in the chain. These are all Westminster style systems, which is interesting and good for a first comparison, but some other different political systems would allow you to compare, like CEA used in a Westminster style system, CEA used in a Netherlands if you want, Switzerland if you want, but a different political system would actually be very interesting to think about different political systems' approaches to CEA.
Yeah, especially
Moving towards a special issue. Sorry, I lost track of who, Kaylin?
Yeah, so just the second part of, I think, maybe a little bit in opposition to what Arthur just said about the different systems. Because they're Westminster systems, it allows you to actually look at the different policies in place, like the policy frameworks in place within those similar systems overarching, and kind of tease out your interest in policy legacies, because the policies aren't exactly the same across sectors. So if you're holding that constant, you're able to see what's varying across policy frameworks within the country. And if you're interested in policy legacies, I think that you need to keep something like a political system quite stable across cases. It's just kind of another argument on the other side for you to think about. And if you want to go the other way, then I think that you might want to put that as a, we thought about this, but decided Kaylin's comment is garbage, and we're going to go with the other approach. But either way, I think it's kind of, there's arguments on both sides. Yeah, that's all it is.
thanks.
Similarly, I think when you going back to like the niche drugs, I guess nowadays for the last little while you call them like rare diseases, right, or the orphan drugs. So like when you're talking about using CAA for those, a lot of countries in the world, with the exception of Canada, have these negotiated policies with their research companies and manufacturers to lower R&D and longer market exclusivity, things like that, so that they come in with a lower price than maybe in a country like Canada, or a country that doesn't have these national policies or regional policies that they negotiate with the manufacturer. So that might just be something to consider when you're thinking about the more niche drugs.
Sorry, in terms of less support for countries developing these?
Maybe the
I'm
role
not
in
sure
CEA in terms of making recommendations for or against a drug, whether or not the country that you're looking at has negotiated previously with the manufacturer to lower the price when it's coming into that CEA arrangement or formulary, whatever it is, so that it is more likely to be approved because of the costs that maybe have already been put into the research and development processes that might not be included in the CEA formula?
Right, but I think I see what you're saying, but in pretty much all of these examples, the risk sharing agreement is after the CEA agreement. The CEA happens, and then there may or may not be a risk sharing agreement.
That might be the case. I think there are some research and development incentives and tax incentives during those earlier stages before the CEA happens, but you're right. But even if the manufacturer can foresee these negotiated things later on, that might incentivize them to lower the price during the CEA negotiations too, right?
Or incentivize them to raise the price, because it doesn't matter if they get rejected for not having a cost-effective drug. Get rejected on the CEA process, and then
just a variable.
And then your public price is high, and your confidential negotiated price is low.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty good outcome if you're a
Yeah.
drug manufacturer.
We're gonna have to wrap up. You may want to pursue things with some individuals afterwards. Thank you very, very much. I think we may